The void is a pretty dark place, and if you stare long enough, you will see what lurks in the darkness. And Unit 731 is a great example of how far humanity can fall into that void. Before we get into exactly what this video will be about, I'm going to say right now that if you have a sensitivity to literally anything, like even if it's just like this much, do not watch this video. This is the biggest viewer discretion advisement that I could possibly give, because this video is going to discuss some extremely heavy topics such as, this whole video is going to be about human experiments, torture, and subjecting people to horrible things. So if you are squeamish in any way or have any trauma that, is prevalent in your life, this video may not be for you. So what is Unit 731? So Unit 731 was a research facility formed after World War I in Imperial Japan. So after World War I, the use of biological and biochemical warfare was banned by the Geneva Convention. However, Japan at the time had this "we're better than everyone" mentality due to extreme nationalism and a military abundance within the country itself. And because of this, they dismissed these restrictions and thought that, eventually somebody is going to break these rules. We need to be ahead of those people for when that inevitably happens. So thus, Unit 731 was formed. Shiryo Ishii, I apologize if I can't pronounce that, but he was the Surgeon General that presented this idea to the Japanese government, and the government was like, that sounds like factoids, and started the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory, which that's what evolved into Unit 731 as a secret biological warfare program that was disguised as a water purification facility in Herbin, Montreal, which is a city in China. The test subjects included prisoners of war and other people, I guess, acquired that way, for lack of a better word, or in similar fashions. And it involved both men, women, and even children. And some of the tests are, this whole thing is extremely barbaric. The reason that they were using these prisoners of war was because at the time in which this was all happening, Japan and China were at war with each other, fighting against each other. So in their mind, it made sense to use people of the opposing side as your, target practice, literally, in these experiments. Because publicly you're not allowed to say that you torture people and experiment on people against their will, especially in enemy-occupied territory, the public knew it as a lumber mill and a water purification center called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit of the Kwantung Army. The narrative given to the public was that it was just a military plant used to study diseases and treat water that would inevitably aid them in the fight against foreign adversaries, basically. And it was, other parts of it were just there to process lumber. So it seemed to be a very innocent and even positive force at play, if you will. They wanted it to be seen as something that was for the people, I guess you could say, for like the greater good of studying biochemical warfare, biochemical weapons, because they, again, were afraid that somewhere down the line, somebody else was going to do it. So that means we should do it so we can get ahead of them. So if we get attacked by someone with like an AIDS ray or something, then we know how to cure the AIDS ray. However, that's on the outside. On the inside was a drastically horrific story. It involves an absurd amount of dehumanization and mistreatment of living beings, where I'm not even going to talk about all of it because I don't feel comfortable talking about it, and we're going to get into that. The staff at the facility called the subjects Marutas. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, which literally means log which was a code used in more like public settings if the scientists or the military generals and whatnot were speaking of what was happening at the facility, because one, human experiments is obviously illegal on every level. Then it would also push this mental state of distancing themselves from their fellow man being tortured, if that makes sense. Like putting that psychological dissonance, I guess you could say, for lack of better words. Because if it's kind of like in war, if you paint the enemy as a monster, the people will be more likely to want to fight them if they're seen as anything but human. And that's what this term was being used for. If you've made it this far and you didn't heed the warning in the beginning, this is your second chance, because now we're going to be talking about the experiments that took place at Unit 731. And these are going to be some of the most brutal, sadistic experiments that I've ever read about that have taken place in the name of science. So strap in. Now, I'm not going to be discussing every single experiment done, because that list goes on for a very, very long time. But these are the more, I guess, documented experiments, because a lot of the information was destroyed, and we're going to get into that later. But first up is a vivisection, which, for those who don't know, which is, from my understanding, basically when you just amputate people's arms or take the organs out. This was performed on thousands of men, women, and even children. They would usually perform these surgeries without anesthesia and would obviously end up with people dying because duh. But basically this was used to study the loss of blood when it came to removing organs and removing limbs, and also they would, if someone was infected with a disease, they would then remove certain organs and or limbs to see how the disease would progress in both the limb or organ and the person without the limb or organ. Sometimes they would even remove a limb and then reattach it to the opposite side of the body to see if it would function, or just to see how the body would react to that. And there are other more specific cases, such as removing one's stomach and just attaching their organs, like their large intestine, to their esophagus. Why? I'm assuming maybe to see if you don't need to digest your food, which is like the whole point of eating it. This is a common thing that I think when I hear these experiments is like, what do you think is gonna happen? People are gonna freaking die, dude. Like, you're gonna, like, oh, I removed his brain or his liver. Like, what do you think is gonna happen, dude? What are you looking for? They're gonna die. Like, I don't know. Next up, we have the biological warfare, and this is a big section because this is primarily the focus of the whole thing. So there's a lot more information about these specific tests than there are the other ones, at least from my research. At least 12 large-scale bioweapon field trials were carried out, and at least 11 of them were carried out on Chinese cities. A cholera attack on Chengde in 1941 reportedly killed 10,000 people due to the biological weapon being used, and 1,700 deaths of ill-prepared troops. So even if you were working there, you weren't safe as well, and that is just one of at least 12 different attacks on unsuspecting civilians that resulted in a large amount of casualties. Outside of experimenting on just massive scales, they would also experiment on prisoners with certain weapons and diseases, such as the bubonic plague, smallpox, cholera, and botulism, to name a few, were purposely injected into people to see how the disease would then progress in people's bodies. Just to see what would happen. It's like Like, my thought process here is, okay, so we have the bubonic plague. We have the information about the bubonic plague. But just in case we're wrong, why don't we just inject these people with the bubonic plague just to see what happens? It's like, we already have that information. Like, the reason we know cholera is bad is because people died. It just kind of feels redundant, and that is another layer to why I think this is so fucked up, is because it's like we already have that information. We know what it does. More biological tests performed were infecting agriculture, reservoirs, and water wells with anthrax and plague-carrying fleas, typhoid, cholera, and rabbit fever. And how they would do this is by flying over with planes and releasing birds or feathers that had been exposed to these diseases and having it just kind of naturally populate in the area. Or they would, I read somewhere that they would develop these bombs that were biodegradable, and then what would happen is the idea was to launch them but have the bomb dissipate in the air. Then these bombs were filled with rats that had a disease, so that when the bomb would dissipate, the idea was that the rats would then land and scurry throughout public areas to spread a disease, and then they would then see how far that disease could spread to then conduct more research, I guess. During these experiments, they would go out in hazmat suits and protective gear and examine dead bodies that were affected by the diseases that they put out. And then, because they're just super awesome people, they would then hand out clothing or food that had been infected with something to people in need to then further the infection rate of whatever disease they wanted to study at the time. So, just imagine that is the most depraved, diabolical shit I can think of. It's like, there's these people in need, they're dying or they're homeless and they're sick. Here, we're gonna give them food and clothes that are infected just to see how these diseases react with react with the human body. And it's, how many people had to approve of that before it happened? Because that is that not alarming to you? Where's the conscience? I get the whole we need to be prepared in case something happens, but that doesn't seem like a rational thought when it comes to that. For me personally, it's I don't know shit about ass, but when you test it on a stem cell thing. I know this is the 40s and the 50s and all, but let's find a different avenue. These biological experiments on the masses of unsuspected civilians estimated to have killed about 400,000 Chinese civilians, and that's a rough estimate because disease spreads everywhere. And wouldn't you think that with diseases, I don't know, maybe someone else can explain this to me. How do you calculate that? Because say you drop a bomb full of rats and they infect 26 people, and then those people go and so on, expose a bunch of other people. How do you then all right, it's done? I wonder if there are people who are still affected. I wonder when the last person to be affected by this stuff passed away. That's what I want to know. Next up, we have weapons testing, and this is pretty basic. Pretty much exactly what you think it is. Any kind of weapon that you can think of that the Japanese military had at the time, people were strapped to, shot at, stabbed, or shot with a flamethrower. They would attach bombs to people just to see what would happen. At varying, distances away, varying armors, stuff like that. It's pretty self-explanatory. Basically using humans as target practice for whatever weapons that they were developing at the time. Another set of tests that has quite a bit of information about it is the frostbite testing. They would, it's pretty self-explanatory, but for specific examples, because that's why we're here, is they would freeze someone's limb, and then they would revitalize it, quote unquote, and see if they could then activate the limb again, like basically freezing a foot and seeing if you can flex the toes, sort of thing. And these experiments also would be performed on not just adults, but children as young as 3 years old to do what exactly? I have no idea. I just can't. A quote from Yoshimura, a Army engineer in charge of the frostbite tests, said during an interview, quote, 2 naked men put in an area 40 to 50 degrees below zero, and researchers filmed the whole process until the subjects died. The subjects suffered such agony that they were digging their nails into each other's flesh. Well, the depravity of it all is ridiculous to me. I don't quite the whole digging your nails into the flesh thing. I was talking with a buddy with this a while ago, and it's what were they, each other? I wonder if they were driven mad, or if I wonder what's going through their brain, During these frostbite tests, they developed a resistance to frostbite index, which here's a photo of that. And basically what they did is, the test was to put people in freezing water for certain intervals of time, and then take them out and then interview them and measure the body's temperature and then just record it. Another contributing factor into that test was their diet. And what they would do is they would, feed somebody a normal diet, and then they would do this water dunking test, or starve someone for a day or 2 days or 3 days, or so on and so forth, to see how starvation and frostbite affected each other. And then they would record this data. Another immaculate test conducted by this stellar group of individuals was the effects of different gas agents. And what they would do is they would test these agents on people in various different forms of protection from the gas agents. So all the way from booty naked to full protective gear. And they would expose these test subjects to different gases to record how the protective gear would protect against it. And then those who survived, they would follow up, a few days here, progressively after the tests were conducted, to see the effects of the gases later down the line. One of the tests performed during these gas chamber gas tests, if you will, was 5 subjects were forced to drink a solution of mustard and Lewisite gas and then just see what happens. So I'm assuming they would liquefy mustard gas and then just have people drink it and then see what happens. What do you expect is gonna happen? I don't understand. What do you expect? People are gonna die. That's why they banned it, brother. No shit. I just, I don't get it. Do you just ignore science? And I understand that, as we'll talk about later, the information was not just about these studies was not just kept to this group once it dissolved. But the reason they banned biological weapons is because it kills people so quickly and in such a uncontrolled way. So just to let's just test this out and just to confirm if that's true or not. My guy, that shit's true. So stop doing it. Now, all of these tests are obviously horrible. One that I want to really hone in on that I think is just absolutely insane are the dehydration tests. They would put these people obviously dehydrated, no water, but then put them in a room full of hot fans that basically act as massive heaters and just mummify them and see the effects. And it's turning people into human jerky is such a mind-numbing thing to want to know. When people are dehydrated, they newsflash, they die. It's I'm not trying to say I get some of these, but oh, we should see, what happens, how long a person could live without water. Sure, okay, like, that might be useful information, but it's like, what would happen if someone were to go without water and then we blast them with a insane amount of heat? Oh, that's a good idea because that happens in everyday life. It's like, maybe in the desert, my guy. But the reason I think this one is so just like gross to me is because I overheat so fast. And the idea of being stuck in a room full of heaters and blasting hot air with no water makes me like, it gives me a headache thinking about it, because we've all had like too many layers on, right? And if you can't get them off, you start to feel like panicky and stuff. I can only imagine the level of agony that would bring me. Not that these other ones wouldn't, obviously, but like, oh my gosh, I hate that feeling so much. The reports of these dehydration tests, while they were basically sweating themselves to death, some people would weigh a fifth of their original weight. If you were 100 pounds, and if you live long enough, I assume, you would be 20 pounds. Insane to me. Insane. Just horrible. Also, this might not go in the video, I don't know, but they also would, like the scientists and the soldiers and shit, would force themselves onto people and then force those people to force themselves onto people such as their own children, and study the effects of different STDs and other traumatic things. And that is as far as I am going to go on that front, because I don't want to talk about it. Some other tests that I'll just list off real quick: placed into low pressure chambers just to see how long it would take for their eyeballs to explode, electrocution, being crushed. They would spin them in like a centrifuge just to see how long people would last until they died, being buried alive, and they would just set people on fire and see how, and just burn them up, just, burn them, dead, over, to study the effects of different burns and stuff. So, pretty cool, pretty needed, pretty justifiable. That's a joke, by the way. I don't actually believe that. So what happened to all these people that took part in conducting these tests? Well, I'm sure like the justice system got them and they were, held responsible, right? Right? Actually, that's not what happened. So with the end of World War II, Japan obviously was defeated, and because of that, they started to destroy a lot of the evidence and findings of Unit 731. I wonder why. And then the facility was shut down shortly thereafterward, officially. Now, the cover-up for this is, dare I say, diabolical. So the scientists were never punished. They denied ever being involved up until about 1988. So a good 43 years after the official end of Unit 731. And then when they did, the U.S. government, more specifically, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, granted them immunity because it would guarantee that the U.S. would get the information on the biological warfares and all these tests that they were running, and the Soviets wouldn't get them. So the thought process was, because tensions were starting to grow with the Russians and the Cold War was eventually going to happen, not that they knew that in hindsight, but you get what I'm saying. They thought it would be better for the US government to have this information over the Russians, because that's how politics works, I guess. And so in order to secure this information, they granted the head generals and head scientists immunity. So that's really awesome to think about, in my personal opinion. Dude, like, it does kind of blow my mind that, these things can happen, and then because of the, in the name of superiority or the end, justifying the means. I can't see that here because I don't think any of the findings were really that significant. Like maybe figuring out how diseases spread in different scenarios. Sure, like I could see maybe that being useful, I guess. But like, what? As I keep saying, what do you think's gonna happen? Like, people are gonna die, and it's like, it makes me think of what could be happening now that we are totally oblivious to, because I'm assuming not a ton of people, like modern, just random, everyday people, care or give a shit about this topic. And that kind of makes me feel weird. That's all I can say. And there's so much more information about this out there, and I apologize if I didn't cover all of it. And if I got anything wrong, I do apologize. I know this can be kind of a sensitive topic when it comes to certain offenses and stuff. The idea of how bad humanity can really get is mind-blowing to me sometimes. It's hard for me to think that there are people out there who can get together in such a large group and perform such horrific acts, especially in the name of science. And I understand that, like, like I said earlier, the means or the end justifying the means, but it's like, how far can you really push that, especially in like a humanitarian sense? And the fact that nobody got punished for breaking the like number one agreed upon thing when it comes to war is insane to me. And it kind of shows how serious we take that rule. And that's kind of concerning, because even if they, didn't want the Russians to have that information, I think the people involved still should have gotten punished for what they did to just normal, everyday human beings. I'm not saying there aren't bad people out there, but like, nobody deserves to be turned into beef jerky or have their limbs cut off and sewn onto their rib cage or whatever. Like, I just, like, let's not be demons. You know what I'm saying? Let's not do that. I'm sorry if this video put you in a bad mood. Thank you for watching if you made it all the way down to this point. And if there's anything you'd like me to cover in the future, please let me know. And I will catch you guys in the next one.